All right, you're going to have to forgive my voice. I'm a little bit hoarse right now. Got a little bit of a cold. Moving into Chapter 2. This is the founding and the Constitution. This is the first of several presentations on this. Introduction, what government does and why it matters. The text talks about a simmering debate over the removal statue of Thomas Jefferson from New York City Hall that happened early, a few years ago. This also reflects conflict over the removal of Confederate statues in different places and the changing of military bases and things like that. Reflects sort of the contested nature of history, but also the contested nature in this particular instance of Thomas Jefferson as one of the founders, but also as a slaveholder. And, so you have two sides of, this fundamental debate, right? On the one hand, Thomas Jefferson is a great man. The guy that drafted the Declaration of Independence. On the other hand, he was a slaveholder, and if you are a black or a person, black American, or a minority, a person of member of the LGBTQ plus community, you might look at Thomas Jefferson as a much more complicated figure. So ultimately, they compromised on this and basically removed the statue from City Hall to the Historical Society, where they could again provide greater contextualization, which I think is, it's appropriate. So when we think about the Declaration of Independence, it was conceived as a rebuke to tyranny and oppression that was perceived on the part of the British, or on the part of the American colonists against the British. The preamble to the Constitution likewise kind of describes the purposes of government as the people drafting the Constitution viewed it, and that was again for them to effectively provide the maximum amount of liberty that was consonant with also the idea of some sort of political order. So the remainder of the Constitution provides for the basic architecture of government and its guiding principles. The debate over the removal of the statues that we've been talking about, both in City Hall in New York City, but also on military bases and in southern cities like Richmond, Virginia, and New Orleans. Again, it reflects this notion that yes, the people that have led us in the past were people of high ideals, but they were also people with a complex legacy. So while most Americans continue to believe in the values of liberty, equality, and justice, we differ sharply over what those values mean and how they should apply to our day-to-day lives, and how government should seek to advance and protect those ideals and how they hold them in balance. So the first founding, again, the idea of why we separated from Great Britain. We have a tendency to focus on the key figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. But, again, there were a lot of people, a lot of Americans that played a significant role in both seeking independence and then ultimately in helping to shape the government that would end up becoming the Constitution. A lot of recent scholarship has drawn attention to two important conflicts that drove Americans toward independence. First and foremost, the colonists didn't arrive on an empty continent. The text discusses this idea of settler colonialism, which refers to a form of basically colonialism that involves removing native peoples from land and replacing them with a new settler population. Something similar had actually happened in Northern Ireland, where they basically took Scottish people and put them in Scottish Protestants and put them in Northern Ireland as a way of sort of displacing the Irish Catholics who were problematic to the English. Another aspect was, of course, and the one that tends to be highlighted in most history textbooks, is the idea of taxation. The British had ruled the colonies with a fairly light hand. But their wars with France and elsewhere had created a lot of financial problems, and they were desperate for revenue in that period, the 1760s, and so there was initial division among the colonists between those who benefited from colonial rule and those who were more what we might call westward looking, who looked at the British as more of a problem than a benefactor. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, most governments got their revenues from tariffs, which are taxes on duties brought into the countries, and other kinds of duties. As the British began taxing the colonies to help defray the costs of their various wars, the cry among the colonies, of course, was this idea of no taxation without representation. Several, again, taxes had a radicalizing tendency among the colonists, and one of them was the Tea Act. In part, again, that because it replaced a lot of colonial middlemen with British. Basically it hurt the colonies economically, and it benefited the crown directly. And a lot of people looked at that as just an intolerable thing. That led to the Boston Tea Party. Where again the people of Boston basically refused to allow British ships holding tea to be unloaded. In other places, they basically just left. In Boston, the colonial governor basically said, "Well, we're just going to wait you out," and the people that were the rabble rousers, if you will, basically went onto the ships and dumped the tea into the harbor. And that led the British to respond with greater levels of coercion, including laws that were known as the Coercive Act. And that led to the organization of the First Continental Congress. At this point, again, the text talks again about the issue of slavery. A lot of the southern colonies relied on slavery as the foundation of their economies. It was very difficult, again, in those southern climates, to keep people working in the fields. A lot of people were dying, so they began importing slaves from Africa. This sort of thing was happening also in Brazil at the time, which became a significant kind of economic trade, if you will. The British instituted slavery in the West Indies as well, but it spread throughout North America. It became a major source of wealth for members of the founding generation like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. So the existence of slavery even in that period was morally controversial, but the fact that so many economic elites of the South had become so dependent on it created a great deal of political pressure to basically rationalize slavery, and they kind of they kind of jokingly described it as the peculiar institution, but nevertheless, they insisted on preserving it because so many of them were so deeply implicated in it. The Declaration of Independence explains why the colonists ultimately break with Great Britain. Again, tensions between the colonists and the British broke into conflict at the basically what became known as the battles of Lexington and Concord, where the British discovered that some colonial rabble rousers were seeking to catch arms in a place inside, outside of Boston. They marched troops to seize that area, seize that armory, and the colonists got there first, and they began shooting. The British ultimately were forced to back into Boston, and that basically started the war. That was where blood was first shed. That led to the Second Continental Congress, which was organized about a year into the war and commissioned the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the Declaration of Independence has sweeping language. All men are created equal. Again, it was fairly ironic, but again, it reflected the ideals of the colonials as it related to white men. We have steadily expanded that idea over time. The remainder of the Declaration of Independence was basically a list of grievances that had been compiled by committees of correspondence that were formed in each state following the Stamp Act crisis of 1765. The European Enlightenment had a profound impact on the founders. They were all classically educated, but they also read Enlightenment figures Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Baron de Montesquieu. Jefferson especially drew heavily on the British and French philosophers in drafting the Constitution. There's an idea of social contract theory, which basically violates this notion, or it basically goes against the notion of divine right, and says, in fact, that rulers owe rulers owe to the ruled their authority. That in fact, this idea of popular sovereignty means that the legitimacy of government derives from the people and not from God or some other influence. Baron de Montesquieu is famous for creating this idea of the separation of powers. And he was the one that basically said, and he was actually looking at the British system and said, the way the British have divided power between a parliament and the king or the monarchy has really created an ideal notion of government where balance is power, power is balanced in a way that compels people to reach for a politics of compromise and accommodation rather than conflict. He kind of soft shoes his way around the centuries of civil war that the British went through to get to that point. So in the end, our first system of government were the Articles of Confederation. They were eventually ratified in 1781, which again was well into the war. The principal aim of the Articles was to limit the powers of the central government. And, this reflects something that's important about most kind of governments formed during warfare. They're oftentimes improvisational, and sometimes they succeed too well. And in this instance, the Article of Confederation, it prevented any kind of central government from forming, which also meant that there was little administrative capacity in the Articles of Confederation and in the Continental Congress, which comprised basically the Confederacy of States. And so there were a number of governing challenges that began emerging. The national government couldn't tax. It really couldn't do anything, couldn't resolve conflicts between the states, and conflicts were emerging. And so there were enormous coordination problems that really were coming into the fore as we get into this, the middle of the 1780s, which sets the stage for the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which we'll talk about in our next presentation.